We are running out of supplies.
I'm aware, but the convoy is delayed. We have to make this work.
Some mistakes don't just follow you home, they sit at the foot of your bed and wait for you to wake up. For 10 years, I believed that if I just kept my head down, lived quietly, and stopped looking over my shoulder, the noise in my head would eventually stop. But life has a strange, almost cruel way of forcing you back into the exact kind of room you tried so hard to escape. When I walked through the heavy wooden doors of Oak Ridge High on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, I didn't want trouble. I didn't want respect, and I certainly didn't want a fight. I just wanted to teach high school history, grade papers, and drink my coffee in peace. But when 4 teenage bullies backed me into a corner in an empty hallway, convinced that a middle-aged guy in an elbows-patched tweed jacket was an easy target, they thought they were going to teach me a lesson. They had no idea that the man standing in front of them had spent 12 years in the Navy SEALs, surviving things that would make their worst nightmares look like a playground game. And by the time they realized their mistake, the silence in that hallway was louder than any scream. The rain was beating a frantic rhythm against the windshield of my worn-out pickup truck as I pulled into the faculty parking lot. I sat there for a moment, letting the heater blow lukewarm air against my knuckles. My hands were calloused, scarred across the knuckles from rope burns, shrapnel, and years of gripping things tightly so I wouldn't fall. I took a deep breath, reaching down to tap the side of my right knee. It always ached when the humidity spiked, a lingering gift from an explosive device in a province I couldn't even name out loud to normal people. To the world, I was Mr. David Vance, the substitute turned full-time history teacher taking over room 204. I had spent the last 2 years getting my teaching certification, deliberately choosing the quietest, most unremarkable public school I could find in suburban Ohio. People in town knew me as the quiet guy who bought his groceries at odd hours, kept his lawn neatly trimmed, and never talked about his past. If someone asked about the jagged scar running from behind my left ear down into my collarbone, I told them it was from an old farming accident. It was easier that way. People don't ask follow-up questions when you mention tractor blades. Walking into Oak Ridge High felt like stepping onto another planet. The air smelled of damp wool, floor wax, and teenage anxiety. I adjusted my leather briefcase, keeping my eyes low, taking note of the exits out of pure habit. You can take a man out of Team 3, but you can't take the tactical mapping out of his brain. Every doorway was a funnel, every corner was a blind spot. I hated that my brain still worked like that, but it kept me grounded. My first 3 periods went by without a hitch. The kids were mostly indifferent, staring at their phones or staring out the windows as I talked about the Industrial Revolution. I preferred indifference, it meant no friction. But during the lunch block, the atmosphere shifted. I was standing near the drinking fountain near the east wing when I heard the low, taunting voices. It was a classic scene, one that played out in thousands of schools every day. A smaller kid, maybe a freshman, was pinned against a row of rusted lockers. Standing over him were 3 varsity athletes led by a tall, broad-shouldered kid named Marcus. Marcus was the classic high school apex predator. He had the expensive sneakers, the varsity jacket, and the complete lack of empathy that comes from growing up without consequences. His father was a prominent local developer who bankrolled the school's athletic program, making Marcus practically untouchable in the eyes of the administration. "Hand over the paper, Leo," Marcus said, his voice flat and mocking. "Or I swear to God I'll drop your backpack out the second-story window into the mud." The kid, Leo, was trembling. He was holding a stack of neatly typed notes. "I spent all weekend on this, Marcus. Please, just let me turn it in." Marcus didn't yell. He just reached out, took the papers, and slowly began tearing them down the middle. The sound of ripping paper was remarkably crisp against the metal lockers. I stood 10 feet away. Every instinct in my body told me to intervene, but the civilian voice in my head urged caution. "Handle it like a teacher, David. Not like an operator." "That's enough," I said quietly, stepping forward. My voice wasn't loud, but it had a heavy, grounded tone that usually made people look up. Marcus paused, the torn paper still in his hands. He turned slowly, looking me up and down. A slow, arrogant smile spread across his face as he realized who was speaking. It was just the new history guy. The guy who wore muted gray sweaters and moved with a slight limp. "Oh, hey, Mr. Vance," Marcus said, not a hint of fear in his eyes. "Just helping Leo organize his thoughts." "Right, Leo?" Leo didn't say a word. He just stared at the floor, his eyes brimming with tears. "Put the papers back, Marcus, and head to the cafeteria," I said, keeping my hands resting casually in my pockets. "We don't do this here." Marcus took a step toward me. He was 6'2", built like a linebacker, and clearly used to intimidating adults who were afraid of getting sued or fired. "Or what, Mr. Vance? You gonna write me up?" "Go ahead. My dad's on the board. He'll throw it in the trash before fifth period." The two cronies behind him chuckled. I looked into Marcus's eyes and felt a strange, cold sensation settle in my stomach. I hadn't seen that look in a long time, that unearned sense of absolute dominance over someone weaker. In my former life, men with that look usually ended up behind the sight picture of my rifle. "I won't write you up," I said softly, looking him dead in the eye. "I'm giving you a warning. Walk away." Marcus laughed, dropping the ripped papers onto the floor. "You're a joke," he muttered, brushing past my shoulder hard enough to try and knock me off balance. I didn't budge. It was like bumping into a concrete pillar. Marcus blinked, slightly surprised by the solid resistance, but he kept walking, throwing a middle finger over his shoulder. I didn't push it further that day. I helped Leo gather his torn pages, told him we'd work out an extension, and gave him a spare notebook from my desk. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought Marcus would satisfy his ego and move on. I was wrong. Bullies don't like it when the air in the room changes around them. They feel the shift in authority, and it terrifies them. By the end of the week, the harassment escalated. It wasn't just directed at Leo anymore, it was directed at me. Small things at first. Dry erase markers missing from my whiteboard. My desk drawers left open. Rude comments scribbled in the dust on my truck's rear window. I ignored all of it. In the military, you learn that emotional reactions are expensive, they cost focus, energy, and sometimes lives. If a teenager thought popping my truck's tires was going to provoke me, he was deeply mistaken. Then came Friday afternoon. The last bell rang at 3 p.m., releasing a wave of shouting students into the rain-slicked corridors. Within 15 minutes, the building was largely empty. Teachers were either heading home or locked in their classrooms grading papers. I had stayed behind to grade essays on the Battle of Gettysburg. The school was quiet, the kind of stillness that always reminded me of the quiet hours before a dawn raid. I packed my leather bag, turned off the classroom lights, and locked room 204. As I walked down the long, dimly lit hall toward the back stairwell, I noticed the emergency fire doors at the end of the hall were propped shut with a wooden wedge, blocking the primary exit. I slowed my pace. My heart rate didn't spike, in fact, it dropped. That was the first thing they taught us in BUD/S, when stress hits, your heart rate should settle like lead in water. Controlled, slow, lethal focus. 4 figures stepped out from the side hallway near the old gymnasium. It was Marcus and his 3 athletic buddies, Trent, a heavy-set wrestler, Kyle, a track sprinter with a mean streak, and Mason, a silent kid who always carried a brass knuckle bottle opener on his keychain. They had closed off both ends of the hallway. No security cameras were installed in this wing, an oversight the administration had been promising to fix for months. Marcus knew that. He had planned this. "Lost, Mr. Vance," Marcus said, stepping into the center of the hall. He had a metal baseball bat resting lazily against his shoulder. "The building is closed, boys," I said, my voice steady, carrying no emotion whatsoever. "Go home. We had a little talk after school, Marcus said, taking a slow step forward. Trent and Kyle closed in from the sides, cutting off my lateral movement. You think you're clever, don't you? Trying to make me look like an idiot in front of everyone. Telling kids they don't have to listen to me. You do that all by yourself, Marcus, I replied calmly. Put the bat down. Marcus let out a harsh crack of laughter. You think you're in charge here? Look around, old man. There's no principal. No security guard. Just us. And you're gonna apologize to me on your knees before you leave this building. I looked at the four of them. They were big, athletic, and full of testosterone and stupid rage. But they were boys playing at violence. They had never felt the bite of cold steel, never smelled burning cordite, and never seen the look in a man's eyes when he realizes he isn't going to make it home. I'm going to give you one chance, I said, my tone dropping an octave, becoming flat and ice cold. Move out of my way. Marcus grinned, lowering the bat and tapping the aluminum end against the linoleum floor. Pings. 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 The metallic echoing was meant to intimidate me. You don't get to give orders here, Vance, Marcus sneered, taking another step. What are you gonna do? Cry. I warned you, I said softly. I'm an ex-SEAL. The word hung in the damp air of the hallway. For half a second, there was a flicker of confusion in Trent's eyes. But Marcus just burst out laughing, a loud, ugly sound that echoed off the metal lockers. A SEAL? Marcus taunted, slapping his knee. Right. And I'm the President of the United States. Look at you. You're a crippled history teacher with a bad leg and a tweed jacket. You think a made-up military story scares me? He swung the bat. Not with full force, but with a sharp, aggressive flick meant to make me flinch, to force me backward in humiliation. He didn't know that my eyes had already mapped the distance, calculated the velocity, and selected the entry point. I didn't step back. I stepped in. Before the aluminum bat could reach the apex of its arc, my left hand shot out like a steel trap, catching the handle right above Marcus's hands. The impact echoed down the hall, but my arm didn't give an inch. Marcus's smile instantly vanished. His eyes went wide as he tried to pull the bat back, but my grip was absolute. It was like trying to pull an anchor out of frozen mud. Before he could process what was happening, I stepped forward with my lead foot, shifting my center of gravity, and executed a sharp, brutal wrist lock. I didn't break anything, I controlled myself with surgical precision, but the agony shot straight up his forearm. Marcus dropped to his knees with a sharp gasp, the bat clattering harmlessly to the floor. What the hell? Trent yelled, charging from the left, reaching out to grab my sweater. Without releasing Marcus's wrist, I pivoted on my good leg, using Trent's own momentum against him. I caught Trent by the back of his neck, directing his forward rush straight into the row of metal lockers. The sound of his head bouncing off the cold steel was like a gunshot. He collapsed into a heap on the floor, groaning, entirely disoriented. Kyle and Mason stopped dead in their tracks. The cocky smiles on their faces were completely gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. I let go of Marcus's wrist. He slumped onto the floor, clutching his arm, hyperventilating. The hallway went utterly, completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The heavy silence was stifling, broken only by the sound of Marcus's ragged breathing and the steady drip of rain outside the high windows. I slowly leaned down, picked up the aluminum bat, and held it casually in one hand. I didn't look angry. I didn't breathe hard. My pulse was still steady, my expression completely neutral. And that was what terrified them most, the utter lack of emotion. Stand up, Marcus, I said quietly. Marcus looked up at me, his face pale, sweat breaking out across his forehead. The arrogant bully was gone, In his place was just a terrified teenager who had suddenly realized he had stepped into the deep end of an ocean he knew nothing about. "Please," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling violently. "Please don't hurt me." "Stand up," I repeated, not raising my voice. He scrambled to his feet, pressing his back hard against the lockers, his hands raised in surrender. Kyle and Mason backed away slowly until they hit the wall, completely paralyzed by fear. I looked at the three of them, then dropped the bat. It hit the floor with a loud clang that made all three of them jump. "I told you," I said, my voice cutting through the space like a razor. "I gave you a warning. You mistook my patience for weakness. That is a mistake that gets men killed where I come from." Marcus was shaking so badly his teeth were clicking. We won't do it again. I swear. We won't touch Leo. We won't come near you." I took a step toward Marcus, and he flinched, pulling his head down. But I didn't strike him. Instead, I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a small, worn piece of laminated paper, and held it out. Marcus hesitantly reached out his hand, taking it with trembling fingers. It was a military identification card, faded at the edges, bearing a black and white photo of a much younger, harder-looking version of me, wearing a Navy uniform with the trident emblem clearly visible next to the words, United States Navy Special Warfare Development Group. Marcus stared at the card, then looked back up at me, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. He had read about SEALs in news articles and played them in video games, but standing 2 feet away from one was an entirely different reality. "I didn't leave that life behind because I was weak, Marcus," I said, looking into his eyes. "I left it because I was tired of violence. I wanted to teach because I wanted to help build something instead of destroying it. But if you force me to protect people here, I will do it with every piece of training I have left." Mason swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "Mr. Vance, please don't report this. If my dad finds out." "Your dad is part of the reason you're like this," I said, turning my eyes to Mason, then back to Marcus. "You think money and status make you invincible. You think power is pushing down people who can't fight back. But real power, real strength, is knowing you can destroy someone, and choosing to lift them up instead." Marcus dropped his head, tears finally spilling down his cheeks, not from physical pain, but from the total destruction of his ego. The silence returned, heavy and thick, but it was no longer a silence of fear, it was a silence of profound shame. "Pick up your friend," I commanded, pointing at Trent, who was sitting up, rubbing his forehead with a dazed expression. Kyle and Mason quickly rushed forward, hooking their arms under Trent's shoulders and pulling him to his feet. Marcus stood there, still staring at the ground, unable to meet my eyes. "Tomorrow morning, you four are going to clean every inch of the cafeteria," I said quietly. "Then you are going to apologize to Leo. Face to face. And if I hear even a whisper of harassment from any of you for the rest of the school year, we won't be having this conversation in an empty hallway. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," Marcus choked out, his voice cracking. "Yes, Mr. Vance. Get out of my sight." They didn't run, but they moved fast, dragging Trent between them as they hurried down the hallway and vanished around the corner. The heavy fire doors slammed shut behind them, leaving me alone in the dim, quiet corridor. I stood there for a long time, listening to the rain beat against the roof. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline dump my body had automatically triggered. I leaned my back against the cold locker wall and closed my eyes, taking deep, slow breaths until my heart rate returned to normal. The next morning, the school felt different. When I walked into the cafeteria around 7:30 a.m., Marcus, Kyle, Mason, and Trent were already there, holding mops and buckets. They were scrubbing the floors in absolute silence. When Marcus saw me walk through the door, he immediately dropped his head and continued mopping, his posture entirely changed. There was no posture, no swagger, no arrogant smirks. At lunch, I watched from across the courtyard as Marcus walked up to Leo's table. Leo tensed up, dropping his fork, preparing for the worst. But Marcus didn't yell. He sat down across from Leo, pulled out a brand new, expensive leather-bound notebook and a box of high-end pens, and laid them on the table. He said something quietly to Leo, bowed his head in what looked like a sincere apology, and then walked away without another word. Leo stared at the notebook, then looked across the courtyard at me. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Leo smiled, a genuine, relieved smile, and opened the book. As the weeks went on, word didn't spread about what happened in that hallway. Marcus and his friends never told a soul, their pride wouldn't allow it, and their fear kept them quiet. But the shift in power was absolute. The hallway bullying stopped entirely, not just for Leo, but across the entire school. Marcus changed. He stopped picking fights, his grades improved, and he started spending his afternoons in the weight room alone, quiet and focused. A few months later, on the last day of the school year, I was packing up my desk in room 204. The afternoon sun was spilling through the window, painting the wooden floor in warm gold. A shadow knocked gently on the doorframe. I looked up to see Marcus standing there. He didn't look like the arrogant bully from the beginning of the year. He was quieter, his eyes clearer, carrying himself with a strange kind of grounded humility. "Mr. Vance," he asked softly. "Come in, Marcus," I said, leaning against my desk. He walked in, keeping his hands in his pockets, stopping a few feet away. "I just wanted to say thank you before the summer starts." I raised an eyebrow. "Thank you? For what?" Marcus looked out the window for a second, collecting his thoughts. "If you hadn't stopped me that day, I would have kept going. I was heading down a really bad path, Mr. Vance. I thought being strong meant making everyone else afraid of me. You showed me what real strength looks like. You could have destroyed us that day, but you didn't. You gave us a second chance." He reached into his pocket and placed something small on my desk. It was the laminated Navy SEAL ID card I had left with him months ago. "I kept it to remind myself," Marcus said quietly. "Every time I wanted to act like a jerk, I remembered what you said about real power." I looked down at the card, then back up at the young man standing in front of me. The anger that used to live in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, determined respect. "Keep it," I said, pushing the card back toward him. Marcus blinked, surprised. "What?" "Keep it," I repeated with a small smile. "Consider it a reminder that no matter how far down the wrong road you've walked, you can always turn around. You're a good kid, Marcus. Just make sure you stay on the right path." Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with emotions he didn't try to hide this time. He picked up the card, tucked it safely into his wallet, and gave me a firm, respectful nod. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. Have a good summer." "You too, Marcus." I watched him walk out of the classroom, his stride confident but calm. I picked up my briefcase, turned off the lights, and stepped into the quiet hallway one last time before the summer break. Sometimes, the greatest victories we win in life aren't fought on distant battlefields with weapons and armor. They are won in quiet hallways, through second chances, by reminding people that true strength isn't measured by how many people you can force to their knees, but by how many people you choose to help stand back up.